To make self-made rouleau loops, you need a square of fabric, and it helps if you've got the selvage edge so you can see, and we've got a 90-degree angle. I'm going to fold it to create a 45-degree angle. With my fabric I have some tiny straight lines, so I can use that as a guide. So gently pat it. Once you've got your 45-degree angle, gently pat it with the iron to crease in the line and just smooth it over. Okay, so I'm going to make some narrow rouleau loops here. So I want them about 1.5 centimeters. So I'm just going to mark it 1.5 in from the folded edge. They can be varying widths, but the first ones I'm going to show you are going to be narrow. So make sure it's 1.5 all the way along your 45-degree folded edge, and then just draw a line, a faint line, either with pencil or with a chalk marker. Once you've done this, we're just going to cut it out. Okay, with the rouleau loops you can make several at one time. You can see the reason they're on the 45-degree angle is so that you can get a little bit of stretch, so the rouleau loop will stretch over any buttons. So again, this is 1.5 centimeters, but with the fold it will, if it opened out, it would be 3 centimeters. So as you can see from the folded edge, 1.5. Okay, we're ready to go to the sewing machine. So rouleau loops for small buttons should be very narrow, so I just use the width, half the width of the machine foot to do a little back stitch, and then make sure you've got a really tiny stitch as well, because we're going to be pulling this through in a moment and we don't want the stitches to break. Sometimes I'll stitch this seam twice, so just in case when I pull it through something snaps. I've got 2 lines, so it just gives it a little bit of strength. If you don't have a rouleau turner, leave a really long end of thread on here, and then what you want to do with your thread is thread a needle, a hand sewing needle, and then drop it down through the tube and pull it down gently. Okay, I'm going to trim down some of my seam allowance because it's a little bit big to go and sit inside the rouleau loop once it's turned through. So again, a long piece of thread on the end with the hand sewing needle, and then you drop it down the tube. I have a rouleau turner, so I'm just going to use my rouleau turner and then very carefully, it's a little bit fiddly because the tube is so narrow, so you push that all the way along, and then the rouleau turner, if you do have one, has a little hook on the end which you put through the fabric, make a hole with the fabric, and then close the loop, and then very carefully pull it through. Sometimes I just trim the end off of the seam allowance, and then it can take a little while to ease it through. Once you start getting it through, it will start moving down. So very slowly, you'll feel all of a sudden it starts to move. There we go, it's starting to go. So the object now is to get the ruler out before pushing it along too far, because sometimes the hook can come away and you have to start again. There we go. So unhook it and very carefully pull the rouleau in the right way. So again, I just make a few of these, and then you can cut them to the length you want with your buttons, so they will vary on the size of your buttons. So once you've made your rouleau, you want to go to the iron and give it a gentle press. There we go. Go back to the sewing machine. So this is going to represent my seam. So to stop the fabric from stretching, I can either interface it at this stage, or what I like to do is just sew a stitch line all the way along on my seam allowance to stop my fabric from stretching when I'm sewing my rouleau loops on. So with your rouleau loops, you can either cut them all beforehand. I prefer not to. So if you've got any little ends on them that are a bit lumpy, just trim the end off. So there we go, trim the end off. So I'll put the cut edge. So you're working on the right side of the fabric. So this is the right side of the fabric you're going to place the rouleau loop on, and the raw edge of the rouleau loop goes to the raw edge of your fabric, which could be your back seam or a front seam. And then you just loop it round, and you can close them or you can have a little gap. What I tend to do if I've got a few of them is I count the stitches in between, so I'll do 4 or 5 stitches and then I'll put another rouleau loop in. They could be right next door to each other if you want them really close, but generally there's a small gap. It all depends what you want to do. So again, mark the second one so it's the same size as the first one. You can measure these out to be really, really accurate. So again, small stitches to make sure nothing moves. Okay, so I've just sewn 2 on to show you. And that's my 2, and they will fold back that way and they will stick out for the buttons to go through. So I have another piece of rouleau which is a much wider one, so it's done in exactly the same way, only it's a much wider one and it's more suitable for outerwear. So what I'm going to do is fold it to get a nice crease in the top, so a nice fold in the top of it. So tuck it under and create that fold. Once you're happy with the shape of it, can you see the shape of it, then I'm just going to gently press it to keep it in place. And then I'll just sew this one on to show you this one in the same row as the others. Obviously I wouldn't do this normally, this is just for a sample. So this is a much thicker rouleau loop for outerwear. And this would work on a much, much thicker fabric as well. So what you can do is you can pin it in place so it doesn't move, and then take it to the sewing machine. Again, it would be done in the same way as the other 2. It's just a lot thicker. So this one's sewn in place. Then I'm just going to sew another piece of fabric on the back to represent a facing or a lining, just for demonstration purposes. So the rouleau loops are sandwiched in a seam between the outer layer and the facing. Generally the facing would be interfaced, but again my seam hasn't stretched because I've stitched it first. And there we go. Once you've done that, then it's back to the iron. Again, just press the seam open to clarify the seam, and then press the facing under. Give each little rouleau loop a tug. Just make sure you've got the seam edge right on the very edge, and then press. Give them a good press. And again, I wouldn't put varying sizes of rouleaus. This is just to show you. You can do different thicknesses and different sizes, and the buttons go through the middle. So I've done a little sample and I've sewn 3 buttons on. One's an outerwear button and that one's going to go through there. So again, you need to gauge the size right with your button. So they need to fit quite snugly. There we go. So that would work for an outerwear, and then the smaller 2 in between the facing will work for a underwear garment or a dress.